Hello, Minnesota. Welcome back. I'm Tony Hernandez. This is the Tony Hernandez Show. Today's Saturday, January 25th. We got a great show. We're going to be bringing on a guest from Minnesota NORML. We're going to be talking about the proposed legislation to legalize medicinal marijuana here in Minnesota. And we're going to also talk about some of the national issues, Colorado and California. And then later, I'm going to be talking with Sam Wayne Pierce. We're just going to be delivering you some news and information and some current events. And I was thinking on the way here that we've been on air now for 1 year. I can't believe how the time flies. So much has happened over this last year. I mean, we're in this nice new studio, but I remember our first show was in the other studio. We had Senator Roger Chamberlain on and some other people, and I'm just so happy and thrilled with where this show is going, and you can see the progress that we're making. Dallas Pearson, our producer, has done a great job. I remember our first shows, we'd have microphone issues all the time, the camera angles, this, that, and the other thing, but Dallas is putting together almost a seamless show here, so thank you, Dallas Pearson, for all your help and commitment to the show. Also, I want to give a reminder that on Tuesday, February 4th at 7 o'clock, it's the Minnesota caucuses. This is your chance to get out there and take part in the political system here in Minnesota. The three major parties, the Republican Party, the Democrats, and the Independence Party, are holding their caucuses, and they're available for anyone to go. So if you go to the Secretary of State website and put in your address or search Caucus MN, you'll find the caucus finder. And just remember that important date, Tuesday, February 4th at 7 o'clock. Go to the Secretary of State website, find out where your caucus location is, and take part, because it's very important. This year in Minnesota, the Minnesota governor seat is up, U.S. Senate, the U.S. House seats, and then every Minnesota state House seat is up. Finally, I just want to encourage people, if you've ever thought about running for office, find out who's in your district, find out what they stand for and whether you're happy or not with his or her voting record, if you feel like they're representing the district or not, and consider getting out there and making a run for office. We need more people taking part on every level, whether it's the state house, the city government, or on federal level. Take part, let your voice be heard. So again, that date is Tuesday, February 4th at 7 o'clock. It's the Minnesota State Caucuses. Go and take part. So with that, there's been a lot of talk about marijuana these days. President Obama recently chimed in saying that marijuana, in his opinion, is less dangerous than alcohol. He recently made that announcement, and Colorado, of course, was the first state to recently legalize recreational use of marijuana, and there's other states that have somewhat similar laws or the medicinal issues surrounding that. So with that, I'm going to bring on our first guest, Mr. Kurtis Hanna of Minnesota NORML.
Hi.
Kurtis, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate having me.
Yeah, this is a pretty timely point in history, isn't it, in terms of the marijuana and prohibition of marijuana? Do you see a lot of changes happening? Can you talk about some of the changes?
Yeah, really the transition is unprecedented. The amount of people that support marijuana right now is more than since they started taking polling. There's probably about 52% of Americans that support legalizing marijuana, 43 are opposed. That's a recent CBS poll. And in Minnesota itself, we really are at a dead heat as far as support for completely moving towards taxing and regulating marijuana, let alone the medical use, which has about 75% support in Minnesota.
And Dallas, if you can put on the website here, it's mnnormal.org. You can see it right there. And can you just talk a little more about the organization, when it was founded, and a little more about that?
Definitely. Yeah, we actually celebrated our third anniversary yesterday. Had a bit of a celebration this morning, actually, over breakfast in Minneapolis. But we are the state affiliate of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, which has been around since about 1970, 1971. And really, we are attempting to really push this issue at a new level that hasn't been pushed before. and we are finding a lot of support out there in Minnesota, and we're very excited.
So your organization then, is there you said it's a state chapter, and there's
Correct.
also a national organization.
Yes.
Is there a focus, like are you focused on getting all use of marijuana and possession of it to be legal, or is every state have a different agenda that they're following?
Our organization, NORML, is interested in the responsible use by adults, and so we're looking at something like 18 and over or 21 and over, being able to purchase it similar to how alcohol is treated in Minnesota. Hopefully we don't also have the Sunday prohibition like alcohol does here, but yes, we would like to see stores allow this to move from the black market into the respectable businesses sort of setting, which we believe will really reduce crime in Minnesota.
And by reduce crime, in what ways will it reduce crime?
Yeah, well, one of the issues is that 12,000 people in Minnesota are arrested every year. Those resources that law enforcement is using to arrest these people could very well be used to go after violent criminals, thefts, thieves. They could go also harder against the hard drugs that are out there. So we believe that it would be safer on that aspect, but also individuals will no longer have to go to the black market in order to buy this substance, which is safer than alcohol, as President Obama has mentioned.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you that. So you say it's less harmful than alcohol. People still label marijuana as what they call a gateway drug.
Correct.
Meaning that if you use marijuana, and I think alcohol and tobacco is actually in that same category, that your chances of going on to harder drugs such as cocaine or crystal methamphetamines is more likely. Is marijuana a gateway drug?
Scientifically, it is not. However, prohibition itself, the prohibition laws on the books in Minnesota, actually push it more towards a gateway drug because it drives individuals that are seeking a safer substance than alcohol to go to the black market, and they then are exposed to other drugs that the people in the black market possess.
So I guess the events in Colorado, with Colorado legalizing recreational use, it seems like there's a reinvigorated debate. As you mentioned, President
Yes.
Obama chimed in, stating his opinion that marijuana was less dangerous than alcohol. Here in Minnesota, there actually is legislation being proposed, and has that legislation been drafted?
It has been drafted. It was actually introduced at the end of the session last year.
And who was the author and who are the co-sponsors? Is this primarily a Democratic bill, or does it have bipartisan support?
It's definitely bipartisan. The head authors, as far as I know, is Scott Dibble, Senator Scott Dibble in the Senate, and in the House is Carly Moline. However, there are a lot of Republican authors on both bills.
And what exactly does this legislation say? Would it legalize recreational use and possession for everybody in Minnesota, or what's the focus of the legislation?
Yeah, really it is to free up individuals to take the recommendation of their doctor and to be able to use a substance that their doctors have recommended for select illnesses so that they can find relief for either just their symptoms or also a cure potentially for the ailments that they have.
And do you know that in 2009 that there was a similar bill that actually passed through the state Senate and the state House?
Yes.
And Governor Pawlenty in 2009 vetoed this particular piece of legislation, so it didn't go into effect in law. And he said that he vetoed it, but he would have considered it if it would have been only for terminally ill patients. But essentially, this legislation opened the door to allow all types of medical uses of marijuana. Governor Dayton, he's recently, just as of a couple days ago, has gone on the record stating that if the law enforcement here in Minnesota is against the medicinal use of marijuana, that he was going to go with law enforcement. So seeing that our last two governors seem to be opposed, and with Mark Dayton being opposed, having the veto power, is this bill dead on arrival?
Well, first I want to clarify that the bill that Governor Pawlenty did veto actually was specifically for terminally ill patients. That was the provision. And so even people that are on their deathbed were denied compassion by that governor. And it seems like we're moving in a similar direction where Governor Dayton says that if the law enforcement unions are not interested or show vocal disapproval for this bill, that it's pretty much dead in the water and a non-starter. That being said, I believe that Governor Dayton is a reasonable person and that he will see the polling numbers that 75% of Minnesotans are in favor of this and 87% of his own party is in favor of this. And also, it's been on the DFL platform since 1992. And for him to stand with the 11% of his party and to be opposed to this bill just seems like a political suicide, frankly, and he will lose this upcoming election if he vetoes this bill.
And so the Minnesota County Attorneys Association and the Minnesota State Sheriff's Association, they've both come out as against this initiative. Is there any way, do you think, that law enforcement is going to change their mind here in Minnesota about the medicinal use of marijuana?
That's a real tough question. Honestly, I believe that the individuals in law enforcement are doing a great service for the state of Minnesota. However, I believe that it's the people higher up in the administrations that are making these decisions. And really, a lot of it's tied to the fact that asset forfeitures and criminal forfeitures go on right now. And it allows the law enforcement agents or agencies that seize marijuana-related, or when there is a arrest related to marijuana, they're able to seize assets, whether that be cash, cars, homes, electronics, and keep about 75% of those assets. And so I really think that we as citizens need to recognize that this sort of policy change will result in less money and less of a budget for law enforcement. And I really think that we should reach out and tell them, we're not trying to slash your budgets. Honestly, we're just trying to provide care for individuals that their doctors have recommended this for. And also we're trying to expand freedom, because as our organization, not this medical bill specifically, but really we see this as a freedom issue, that individuals should be able to decide what goes into their body and what doesn't. And that, that seems like a good sort of thing for our state, to be a little bit more free. And I personally see our organization as freedom fighters that are trying to remove the oppressive system that is in place.
Mm-hmm. And we'll talk a little more about that. In 2012, Republicans allowed the voters of Minnesota to vote on the Minnesota Marriage Amendment, and there was also another proposed amendment to the state constitution that would have required voters to show an ID when they went to vote. The strategy, as some would say, that the reason why they put this up for a referendum or for a constitutional amendment and for the people to decide was because they knew that Governor Dayton wouldn't sign the marriage law. He wouldn't sign voter ID as well.
Right.
And so they circumvented them or bypassed them and put it on the ballot and had the voters of Minnesota decide. So my question is that on the table at all? And they did it in Colorado, too, to legalize the recreational uses. They actually had the voters of Colorado decide. Is that on the table here in Minnesota? Is it possible that Minnesota voters will be voting on the legalization of marijuana?
Honestly, I would love to see that happen. However, it really is going to come down to whether the legislators, specifically the DFL leadership, are willing to lead themselves and to make a statement to Minnesotans that they do care about the sick, the poor, and the ill and the dying in our state, because there is a mass exodus going on right now of families from Minnesota that are fleeing here and the oppressive system that we have to go to more free states like Colorado, Washington, and other medical marijuana states. So it's really an up-in-the-air situation, and it really comes down to whether the citizens themselves are going to be putting the political pressure that's necessary on their elected officials to make sure that they know that this is a wedge issue in these upcoming 2014 elections, and that they really can't hide or pretend or wait until next year when a study gets completed.
So say that medicinal marijuana is legalized in Minnesota. Would cities that perhaps don't want to have medicinal distributors in their particular city limits, would they have the ability to essentially outlaw them? For instance, could Bemidji say, we don't want to have medicinal marijuana in our city limits, therefore all medicinal distributors are basically operating illegal in our city?
Well, one thing to mention is that the bill will only allow a small amount of dispensaries, specifically one per county, unless those counties are larger, then they will have either two, and in Hennepin County there will be three.
Do you agree with that? I mean, do you think there should be limits on the amount of dispensaries per county?
I personally don't agree with that, but at the same time, I am aware that this is a political issue, and I'm willing to make concessions to individuals that believe that this is a better way to move forward. However, I just believe that there ought to be safe access for anyone definitely anyone that has been recommended to use this by their own physicians. And so potentially that will be a burden, especially in rural Minnesota. But if you live more than 15 miles away from a dispensary, you can actually grow your own under the current provisions of this bill.
I mean, that's interesting that they'd want to limit it to a certain amount, one per county, or in the metro, two or three per county. I mean, how do you choose which individual is going to be fortunate enough to basically have a monopoly over that county? It seems like it's opening the door almost to more crony capitalism, which I think is another conservative argument that I've heard people make about why marijuana shouldn't be legalized, is because they look at it as giving the government more control to another market. It's giving them more access to revenues, more regulations, and in effect it's ultimately going to be benefiting itself and then growing the scope of government. What would you say to those people?
Well, I would definitely agree. I am a free market proponent. However, I see this as incremental change. Currently, this is completely prohibited across the board in Minnesota. If you sell even 1 gram, it is a felony offense. And so if you're trying to provide for patients, it will be nice to actually have storefronts where you can provide in a safe, open way and pay taxes on the revenue that you make. But at the same time, I just believe that it is not going far enough. I'm willing to stop here if this is all that we can get this year. But I would challenge Republicans that are saying these things about this specific bill to offer an amendment to make this more of a free market than is currently existing. I don't think they'll take me up on that challenge, but really the main concern, in my opinion, is getting safe, reliable medicine to people that need it.
And Kurtis, I wanted to get your opinion too, because, and I've gotten into some debates with my constitutional friends and others about this, but marijuana is a Schedule I drug. It's, as you pointed out, a felony to, I believe, possess and distribute marijuana, especially if you're selling it. It's a felony.
Yeah.
States have legalized it, like in Colorado. However, there's the supremacy clause of the Constitution, and there's also a pretty long list of Supreme Court decisions that state wherever there's a conflict between state and federal law, basically the federal law trumps the state law. I know that Attorney General Holder has gone out and ordered a memo or a directive to the other U.S. attorneys saying don't prosecute these marijuana cases where they involve patients and doctors, and they don't involve cartels and things like that. But aren't we just 1 or 2 administrations away from a new president and a new attorney general that could basically order or send out a different type of memo to the attorney saying prosecute all people who are violating federal law, whether they're a medical distributor, whether it's a recreational distributor, or whether it's just somebody who's using it? Isn't this a disaster in the making, especially in a state like Colorado?
Well, you get to a good point. Marijuana is currently in Schedule 1, both at the state level and at the federal level, in Minnesota and in most states, actually, even the ones that have medical bills. And it is true that Gonzalez versus Raich is a court case that says that the state of Colorado, individuals in the state of Colorado, do not have the ability to sell what is grown in their own garden.
And we put up the case that you're talking about
very
here.
good. Yes.
Gonzalez versus Raich. This was decided in what year was this?
I believe it was 2004 or 2003. I'm not exactly sure, but the main idea is this ruling says that the supremacy clause does trump state law. However, there is another set of cases, and that is Gonzalez versus Oregon, which relates to...
Is this the same Gonzalez?
The same guy, yeah.
Okay.
He was the former Attorney General.
Okay.
And the state of Oregon actually decided to sue the federal government, and it was related to the fact that their citizens passed an initiative to say that there is a new law that people can have death with dignity, and that they can get prescribed a Schedule II drug that will effectively end their life and put them out of pain. And the federal government, the Attorney General Ashcroft at the time, sent the DEA and agents into Oregon and started arresting doctors that were prescribing this. But what came out of it was that the state of Oregon ended up standing up for its patients. It stood up for the law that was passed by its citizens, and it told the federal government that issues of medicine reside at the state level constitutionally, and also in the Controlled Substance Act itself. It is very clearly articulated that states get to decide this issue, and that the states then are supposed to direct the DEA to also remove marijuana from Schedule 1. And the definition of Schedule 1 is that it has no accepted medical use in the United States. And so, in essence, the 20 states in our country that have medical marijuana laws on the books are really kind of selling out their own citizens by not protecting them from the federal government, by simply following the Controlled Substance Act and issuing a petition for rulemaking to remove marijuana from Schedule 1 from the Federal Controlled Substance Act.
Well, that's very interesting. And
Yes.
One of the things I thought about too, because I'm not going to name this person, but I know somebody who's very, very wealthy.
Yeah.
Made a lot of money here in Minnesota, and ended up selling his business, and he's well into his 60s. But what he wanted to do is he actually moved to Colorado. He bought a bunch of acreage there in anticipation of the laws changing. He invested $1 million into a medicinal farm for marijuana. And as his crop was growing, his lawyer came to him and was basically like, well, there's this law and you're limited to this many plants and you could be potentially violating this federal law. And basically what this guy did is he burned his whole farm down, got out of the business, lost $1 million.
Wow.
But beyond that, what I'm wondering is with the growth of the federal government, okay, because that's really what we're talking about, is that conflict between the federal government and the state. My constitutional friends are like, oh, the DEA, they can't go to your house and they don't have constitutional authority. And it's like, well, I'm glad you're not my lawyer, because if the FBI shows up at my door, like, for better or for worse,
Right.
You're in a lot of trouble, or you're going to have to defend yourself in one form or another. But, the NSA making headlines with all the spying that they're doing, the IRS growing as a result of the Affordable Care Act. If you're going to go on the books and be a marijuana distributor or grower, aren't you basically flagging yourself to be audited by the IRS, to be investigated by the DEA, and to be super NSA'd, wiretapped and the whole deal?
Yes, and this is kind of something that we as Americans should probably weep over, but the NSA itself has given information to the DEA related to drug-related crimes, and the DEA had an internal directive to hide the fact that the NSA had given them this intel. And effectively, this is an erosion, or pretty much a dismantling, of our Fourth Amendment right to not have our property seized and searched. And so the treason that's going on is at a massive scale right now. And it seems to me like it is time for us to really stand up for our rights, because if it's not us, then who will?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was just a recent poll that was done by a major organization, but they found that the majority of Americans were happy that Edward Snowden did what he did in terms of exposing the enormous security apparatus and spying agency that's a worldwide network. So it is definitely something that that we need to be concerned about. I believe that. So finally, if you were in Congress, or if we had Representative McCollum here, or Congresswoman Bachmann, or Congressman John Klein, what would you tell them that we need to do on a federal level that you would think is well suited for your cause?
Well, in all honesty, I believe that at the federal level, they simply should, keep the laws that are on the books. I think that the problem really resides in the states themselves. It's the states that are not stepping up to the feds. Really, I would probably argue to these congressmen and women that they ought to make a change. If a state had attempted to stand up for its own citizens and its own patients already, and the DEA said no. However, no state has actually stood up for its patients and asked the DEA, or pretty much told the DEA, that they have decided that marijuana is a medicine and it must therefore be removed from Schedule I of the Federal Controlled Substance Act.
Well, Kurtis Hanna, thanks for coming on, and can you just tell the viewing audience a little more about your organization, and if they wanted to help out, or if there's any events coming up that you could let them know about?
Yeah, definitely. Our organization is Minnesota Normal. You can find us at minnesotanormal.org or mnnormal.org. We're also on Twitter, on Facebook, and we have meetings the fourth Saturday of every month, and that's at 10 in the morning. And sign up for our newsletter and find out what's going on, because we've got a lot of exciting things happening, and the sky's the limit, really. We're riding the crest of the wave right now, and the momentum's on our side, and I'm excited for the next year.
So you said if you go to your website, mnnorml.org, if you go on the calendar there, you said when are your meetings?
The fourth Saturday at 10 a.m.
Okay.
I'm not sure if the next one's up there yet. Also, I'd like to mention that the Thursday after the session begins, I believe it's February 27th or 28th, we are having an event at the Minnesota Historical Museum. They currently have an exhibit related to alcohol prohibition, and we rented it out for the night, so we're going to have a fundraiser where people can attend the museum, get some food, and find out about the correlations between how alcohol prohibition, the grand experiment that failed, parallels almost exactly to the situation we're in right now, with rampant black market crime and a lot of crony capitalism, and a lot of federal dollars coming in that really should be brought back to the state level, or not spent at all, really.
Well, Kurtis Hanna, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah,
I hope you come on again.
Yeah, I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So that was Mr. Kurtis Hanna from mnnormal.org, and he's working for the legalization of marijuana here in Minnesota. And again, their website is mnnorml.org. I invite you to go check it out. And with that, we're going to bring on our East Coast correspondent, Mr. Samuel Wayne Pierce. And before we do, though, I wanted to play a quick clip from our NFL season preview that we did last September, and it's pretty remarkable to see the predictions that were made here. So, Dallas, if we can line that up right now. Super Bowl predictions.
Tough one. I'm going to go with the Seahawks and the Broncos. Seahawks are going to win.
Yeah.
I'm going to go with the Broncos and the 49ers, with the Broncos winning.
Yeah, I'm not going to change any of these divisions. I think we all agree on the Broncos, but I'd rather go with the 49ers. The coaching is just too good there. I like Seattle, but I don't think you beat the 49ers.
Tony, I'm just that good. Well, let me correct you though. I'm not 100% yet. I should have said I'm going to take the Seahawks and the Broncos and let it go to Benner. I went as far as to say the Seahawks are going to win. So now I've got to watch the game and hope that the Seahawks win so that my prediction is really 100%. But first of all, kudos to you and the staff for getting all those great NFL analysts. Going into last weekend to Championship Sunday, all three of your analysts had their Super Bowl pick alive. Seattle beat San Francisco, so we were all very close. I will say this much. Recent years in the NFL, you usually get a wild card team, a lower-seeded team that makes a run. This year, that did not happen. Last Sunday, Championship Sunday, you had the four best teams playing, the four best teams that people thought were the best at the beginning of the year. They survived, and they played to get to the Super Bowl. So it was a little, they were safe picks, I guess. Let's not be, I don't want to pat myself on the back too much.
Speaking of our picks too, Sam, we didn't get a whole lot of time to talk about the first annual Tony Hernandez Show Award recipients, and, kind of got to the last minute with that show, but I wanted to talk a little more about the two individuals that won the award. First of all, your pick, Representative Mary Franson, I'm sorry. Can you talk a little more about why you chose Mary Franson to be the first annual award winner?
I'd be glad to, Tony. When we decided to do our awards for Tony Hernandez Show Minnesotans of the Year, it was a little challenging for me not being there in Minnesota other than my trip out last summer to do that NFL show and the state fair and everything else. So what I did, Tony, was I reviewed our shows. I looked at all of the great guests we had on. I've talked at length about some of them, Johnny Howard and the various candidates for governor, and certainly Representative Franson. I looked at not only who was a great guest, but it had to be a Minnesotan of the Year. I felt like it had to be someone who was making a difference in the community, someone who was a leader, and I wanted to see genuine, authentic leadership. I looked at the way that Representative Franson put herself out on Facebook and Twitter and reached out to constituents. She let them know where she would be, when to come see them. She did it and does continue to do this on such a regular basis, and then gives updates for the people that can't make it as to what their discussions were like. I love that open forum, both virtually and at the coffee house or wherever she meets with constituents. And her dedication to her constituents, I want to give one excellent example. This happened right before we named our awards. She had a constituent that had to join MNsure, and it was coming up on the new year, and this particular constituent had a teenage child, a dependent, that had to have a surgery. They could not find out in the messy MNsure rollout, they could not find out if this procedure was going to be covered. So here's Representative Franson, who was adamantly opposed to Obamacare and MNsure. But now she has a constituent who is very scared, calling her office, and then she and her staff work tirelessly to get in touch with MNsure, make sure everything is okay, and that this constituent is not going to see outlandish medical bills. So when you have a political leader who sees something get put into law that she doesn't particularly support, but then has to work within that framework for her constituents, that is leadership, and that is why she was my Minnesotan of the Year.
Yeah, and I think she's a great choice, and I apologize for calling her Mary Hanson at first because my old manager is named Mary Hanson. That's why I kind of float off that way. But to add on top of that, part of her character, which I find very admirable, is she's a single mother, and she's young. She's just over 30 years old, I believe, and so she's really up and coming, and she's still at the very forefront of her career. And you can see, the younger leader in her, where you said she's willing to engage the public. She's transparent with her thoughts.
She's actually in it for service. She's not in it for herself or her party. And we need more leaders like that in politics.
Yep.
She's refreshing.
Yeah, and I've talked to constituents in her district that maybe don't fall in the same party as her, but they say that they respect her because her viewpoints are black and white. You know where she stands. Yes. She's not wishy-washy, and she doesn't try to skirt around the issue like so many politicians do. So I think that's why the people really admire, and a great pick, Sam. And as you know, my pick was school board member Chu Vu. He's now sworn in to the St. Paul School Board. When he appeared here first as a guest, right at the very beginning of his campaigns, he was a candidate then. He wasn't even, I don't even think he was endorsed at that point. And it was just, we got to see the transformation of a candidate to somebody who was elected to somebody who was sworn in. And I also admire about Chu Vu is that he is also not a staunch partisan by no means. I really got the feeling that he wants to build consensus, and that Chu Vu is also dedicated and committed to the students of St. Paul, which I think we need more school board members that are putting the students first and not the unions or the teachers' unions and whatnot. We really need to have that refocus of education back to the students, and then also back to the relationships of the students and the parents and getting them involved, because that's a huge factor in terms of determining the success of a student. So I chose Chu Vu as the Tony Hernandez Minnesotan of the Year Award. And then our Audience Member of the Year Award was Karen Bauman, who is just a loyal watcher of the show. She's always commenting, she's always sharing the show on her Facebook page and Twitter accounts and stuff like that. So Karen Bauman was the audience viewer of the year. So it's pretty amazing though, isn't it, Sam, that we've been doing this show for 1 year. I mentioned it at the beginning of this show that it's basically a year right around this time that we've been broadcasting week in and week out on SCC television studios, and we also replay on SPNN in St. Paul, and our show's grown. It's gotten better. We've gotten a ton of great guests, and it's really kind of daunting too to think about what's in the future here. But we're just going to take it show by show. That's really all we can do.
I want to add that in addition to all your fans there in Twin Cities and Minnesota, now with the YouTube channel and these smart TVs, you can browse through your apps. If you have a newer TV, you can go straight to the YouTube channel, and it plays so well. So I have played and replayed the show for a lot of fans that you have in New York as well.
Yeah,
so,
that's pretty awesome. The internet and what it's done for the ability to reach a new audiences is pretty unbelievable. And I just can't wait till that day where we have a website active and where we can read your blogs too. When do you think that's going to be coming?
We're working on it. We should let the viewers and the followers know. You did a great job getting the domain set up, and we went to work on it Thursday night for the first time. So I don't want to give an Obamacare-like timetable, but within the next week or two, we'll be able to give a timetable and start directing our viewers to more content online. So that's in the works.
Yeah, we're not going to spend $70 million on this website. I think we're going to get it up and running for about $500 or so. So.
And Tony, Minsure, as long as we went there, Minsure was certainly a big deal in the news in Minnesota this week, huh?
Yeah, it was. It's pretty amazing to see all the mainstream media here, KARE 11, KSTP, the Star Tribune, the Pioneer Press, even MinPost. They are reporting on the facts of Minsure, and there's a lot of dissatisfied people out there. I know that Minsure is saying now that you can call in and take paper applications, and it's shocking to hear that after spending $70 million on a website, that the most efficient way to get your health care is the old-fashioned way of a paper application. But there also was a recent audit or a review of Minsure, and it was a pretty, can I say damning on TV? It was a pretty damning review. And, it didn't have a lot of good things to say. It pointed out a lot of the deficiencies in the Minsure website. And there was also a recommendation in there that it might be that they need to scrap the whole thing and start brand new, which, you're in web programming, Sam, in software. If you start making something and you put all this time and effort into it, but it turns out to be a bad website, that is kind of what businesses have to do sometimes, isn't it? They scrap it and have to start with a whole new platform.
Generally,
We've done it with our website, and it's not even up and running yet.
It would depend on underlying infrastructure, Tony. And my understanding is that the infrastructure for the site and the call center both are just overwhelmed. So a decent consultant might come in and say, you don't have the underlying infrastructure to support what you're trying to do, to support the volume. And if that were the case, then they may have to put new servers, new storage, new networks, new databases in place. And then they may look at the software, that part of this, what's called the stack, after your hardware, the software, and say, this is totally inadequate. It's not salvageable. So, Tony, I even read that there are some people saying, if you scrap it, can Minnesota afford to start over, or does the state have to just join the federal exchange?
Yeah, there's a lot of big questions to be asked about that, and I'm wondering, Sam, there's a lot of attention being paid to the website, and the perception seems to be almost that what Obamacare is, or what the Affordable Care Act is or MNsure is just a website, and it may be actually distracting from the core principles of the Affordable Care Act, because healthcare is more than a website. Healthcare is access to a doctor, it's affordable care, it's having low-cost medications, it's preventative, and I'm wondering if all this website drama is just a distraction for the real core problem, which is the actual bill. What do you think about that, Sam?
I think it was during enrollment last fall, Tony, when we started talking about all of the horrible problems, particularly with the federal exchange. But then all of a sudden, the new year comes, and people are seeing what we would call sticker shock with their plans, with their high deductibles, with their high premiums and copays. So now all of a sudden, the Affordable Care Act, it looks like, is anything but affordable. And Tony, you were exactly right. People clearly consider good health care more than a functioning website or call center, whether that's in the Twin Cities or on a federal level. And Tony, it looks like President Obama understands this, and maybe that's why he interjected himself into the marijuana debate last week to get a break from affordable care conversations. He went as far as to say that marijuana is no more harmful than alcohol, maybe even less harmful on an individual consumer basis, whatever that means. Your last guest, Mr. Hanna, would probably agree with that, right?
Well, I'm not going to argue with President Obama's opinion on marijuana, as I think he's very qualified to speak on the subject. But what I do have a little bit of issue is that with this interjection of healthcare, it's like, how can they say that marijuana is healthcare and then something like abortion is also healthcare? On January 22nd, it's the 35th anniversary of 35th anniversary of Roe versus Wade, and pro-lifers across the entire country got together at state capitals, at churches, and all these other places to bring recognition to the issue of life here in the United States and the repercussions of the Roe versus Wade decision. And I thought it was really interesting coming up to this anniversary that your governor, the governor of New York, Cuomo, is it Governor Andrew Cuomo, is that his name? He actually went out on a radio interview and started berating conservatives, and he went on the record and said that there is no place, and I'm paraphrasing him here, but he basically said there's no place for pro-lifers in the state of New York. And I thought that was an incredibly irresponsible statement, especially since mainstream America, for the most part, is pro-life. Like, they may not vote on that particular issue when they go to the ballot during election time, but there's Gallup polls that have shown that something over 50% of Americans self-identify as being pro-life, whereas only around 41% of people identify as being pro-abortion. So what do you say, Sam? You said you didn't hear too much pushback from the brave and free press corps over in New York, did you?
Well, there's certainly been a lot of fuss over what Governor Cuomo said on a national level, Tony. I think it was, and that's okay. I certainly followed the story, but I think the outrage mostly came from outside the state. Within New York, I didn't hear a lot of people too upset. So I'll briefly go back to what he said. His quote, I've got it right here. So he said, within the quote, he said, he's talking about conservatives, and he said, are they these extreme conservatives who are right to life, pro-assault weapon, anti-gay? So a few things, Tony. Let's recall that last year our New York Republicans in the state legislature allowed Governor Cuomo and the Democrats to push through something called the SAFE Act, where they basically exploited the Sandy Hook tragedy for the sake of overnight gun legislation. It clearly infringes on our Second Amendment rights. But I'm in a pretty small minority of New Yorkers who feels that way, Tony. So as far as his anti-assault weapon, which was a little bit ridiculous to put it that way, but his anti-gun rhetoric is, I don't think, that out of character for New York. The anti-gay thing, gay marriage passed here several years ago. I don't know anyone or know of anyone who's been harmed because of that. You know how I feel about gay marriage. I think our political leaders have a lot bigger fish to fry, and who am I to tell someone they can't marry who they love? But so that's 2/3 of what he says, and then it gets down to the pro-life versus pro-choice. And there is a large Catholic population upstate and New York City both. Certainly Cardinal Timothy Dolan weighed in. He was not happy with what the governor had to say. So I think the anti-abortion or the anti-pro-life part of his comment was the only part that got him into trouble within the state. But I also think it's going to blow over. A lot of these Catholics, Tony, are going to go vote for Governor Cuomo when he's up for re-election.
Well, we'll have to see about that. I think that these statements that he made are going to come back to haunt him. Although you may not see much pushback in the mainstream media of New York, I do guarantee you that in those local churches, those Catholic churches in New York, which are peppered throughout the state, and the people who do identify themselves as being pro-life, I do think that they will punish him the next election season. But we'll have to wait and see. And Governor Cuomo, he's not the only governor to be getting into trouble here. Our own Governor Dayton here in Minnesota has been in a lot of hot water lately, whether it's the failed rollout of MNsure, some other controversies that are coming about. A lot of people are saying that Governor Dayton is in trouble. There's 5 or 6 really good, strong Republican candidates that are vying for the endorsement to run against Governor Dayton. And, recently, and you couldn't find this story in the Pioneer Press or Star Tribune. If you did, it was in some corner where I couldn't find. But the Duluth News Tribune reported something that the legislative auditor, when Randy Gilbert was on last week, he was talking about the legislative auditor. His name's Mr. Nobles. But basically, he is saying that Governor Dayton broke the law by taking campaign aid on the plane. And Dallas, we're going to pull up this article here so that we can see it if you can. It's right here. Here's the news article. It says, Dayton broke the law by taking campaign aid on plane. And again, you're not seeing this in too many of the news sources in Minnesota, but I think it's a pretty huge deal. The legislative auditor is saying that in 2012, Mark Dayton broke the law when he took a campaign aide with him on a 2012 state airplane trip. Auditor James Noble also said state law is not clear about whether the governor can use a state airplane for traveling to political events. I say they absolutely should not. The auditor scolded Dayton for taking a campaign aide with him to Bemidji and International Falls on October 24th, 2012. And the chief of staff said it was an error and it will not happen again. But basically, you can't use the Minnesota state governor's plane to go to political events or take campaign staff, and that's exactly what he did here. And they're saying that he broke the law. Whether or not this is going to actually come back to haunt Governor Dayton, we'll have to see. But I happen to think it's a pretty big deal because he's the governor of our state. He's the one signing all these laws. into action, and if he in himself is breaking them, on top of some of the scandals that came out with the Democrats in terms of using these independent expenditures or having cooperation amongst candidates, and some of these C4s was another violation, and they ended up having to pay $100,000 to do so. It was a $100,000 fine, the biggest fine in Minnesota state history. But some shady things that come out of the Democratic Party here in Minnesota, and it doesn't seem like these stories get a whole lot of attention, Sam. It seems though that when it's a Republican that screws up, the media just jumps on it and they broadcast it everywhere and they use an example. See, look at these, crazy people. But do you see the hypocrisy in there, Sam?
I sure do.
Whoops, Sam, I think we're...
I say this on the air.
Sam, I think we're losing you for a second here. Hold on.
Oh.
Can we hear you now?
Yep.
Okay, there you are. Go ahead now.
So just on an aside, if Governor Dayton ever wants to fly me on the plane to International Falls, I've never been there. I'd love to go, and I want to say on the air, I'll look the other way on that law. But so Tony, back to be more serious. Maybe there is a bias. There's no maybe about it. Look at on the national level how much attention Chris Christie has gotten for a traffic jam, yet we still can't get an answer as to why our ambassador was murdered in Libya. So on the national level, certainly, and then on the state level, it sounds like in Minnesota that may be the case. You and I could only find a little bit about Governor Dayton with that article you just cited. But I was looking through some other Minnesota news and noticed that 2 Republican legislators are getting some negative press. It sounds like probably deservedly. It sounds like Senator Sean Nino and the Minnesota State House Minority Leader Kurt Doudt. It looks like these guys are from the same district too, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, yeah, it's the state Senate district. Senator Nino, he's the senator there, and then there's 2 House districts per Senate district.
Okay.
And the Republican House Minority Leader Kurt Doudt is the state House representative there.
So the feds are going to sue or are suing Nino for $750,000 for a small business loan that flopped, and then Kurt Doudt was arrested after his friend pointed a gun at a family from a car sale gone wrong. So while the press has ignored Governor Dayton, they certainly paid some attention to this. But Tony, what is happening with some of these Minnesota Republicans?
I think it's election year, and so there's a lot of digging that goes on, and the state House majority is up this year, and so Kurt Doudt is a target for the Democrats, and I think some poor judgments were perhaps made on his part. He was driving into his credit. He has admitted to all of this. He went on an interview on KSDP, fully disclosed it, although it was a few months after the fact, and after somebody dug it up. But he was going to Montana to buy an antique car, which they already put a deposit down online, which I'm not quite sure why anyone would ever do that with a car without first seeing it. But then they got to see the car, and the car was in worse condition than what was told to them online. And an argument ensued, and his friend, his 24-year-old friend, ran to Kurt's car, grabbed Kurt's gun, and allegedly wielded it in front of this family, pointing the gun at them. And he's being charged with 3 felonies right now. Kurt Doudt, to his defense, he said that he wasn't arrested. He said that he was handcuffed, but that he wasn't booked. There are some conflicting reports as to whether he was arrested or not, but he wasn't charged with any crimes here. But I do know that local leaders in his BPOU are talking about whether to have a vote of no confidence in the Republican minority leader, and and they have every right to do so. But again, I think these are big issues, but it just shows how much attention is paid when a Republican screws up. But if a Democrat breaks the law, it's just everyday news, and it's just bypassed. It's only reported on the Duluth News Tribune, and not the mainstream. So I think it's pretty remarkable. To Senator Nino's defense, he hasn't issued a statement about this. It was a student or a small business association loan that he got for $650-something odd thousand, and he has gone default on the loan. But we don't know the details surrounding that, and I'm sure that more is going to come out in terms of what exactly happened with that money, and so we'll be watching that.
Well, certainly one person who's been paying attention is the DFL chairman, Ken Martin. He's been attacking the senator, calling him a hypocrite for taking a government subsidized loan that now has flopped, since the senator is typically touts himself as a fiscal conservative. You can see that on the surface, it looks like a little bit of hypocrisy.
Yeah, it does. I mean, Republicans made a big deal about Solyndra. Now, granted, that was almost I think it was a half a billion dollar loan that was given to Solyndra, and Solyndra ended up flopping and defaulted on the loan, and essentially that loan is on the backs of the taxpayer after that. And so I guess this would be considered maybe something similar to Solyndra, but again, we have to wait until more facts come out with that. So, but yeah, there's a lot of things happening, and this election year, there's a lot up for grabs here in Minnesota. The Minnesota governor, the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House, and then all the Minnesota state House seats are up, and the Democrats are going to be coming out swinging, and so I think it would be prudent for Republicans to address some of these issues now and deal with them now, and then start moving forward. And if that means some heads need to roll, then let them roll now, and let's move on so that we can win elections this coming November.
And Tony, I think it'll be interesting to hopefully have more candidates on the show, or even have candidates that have appeared already when we talk about the governor's race. I think you've had, what, five of the six candidates have been on the show?
I think we've had only three right now. We had State Senator Dave Thompson. We had Jeff Johnson, who's a Hennepin County Commissioner. And we had former State Representative Marty Seifert. Those are the three that we've had on. And then there's Scott Honor, who is running, and Representative Kurt Zellers, who's the former House Majority, or the Speaker. And he actually is leading the pack in terms of fundraising. Kurt Zeller's numbers just came out. He raised $400,000 plus in 2013, which puts him at the forefront. And he has, I know, a lot of support right now, but there are also people who are working against them, because he was the House Majority Leader in 2010, and basically we lost it after that. So.
Well, hopefully we'll be able to get these guys on, and candidates running for other offices. And I think you do a great job extending that invitation to anyone from any party running. This should be an interesting year for guests on the show.
Yeah, I would love to be able to have Governor Mark Dayton come on the show. I think I'll send out an invitation to his office this week. And maybe he'll accept, and we'll have Governor Dayton here at the SCC television studios, because I would just ask him fair questions.
Sure.
I'd ask him questions about MNsure, the rollout of MNsure, whether he was confident that the government was going to be able to build this website effectively and efficiently, and talk about some of the downturns that have happened and some of the glitches with that. And then also I'd ask him about the auditor, the legislative auditor, and his allegation that he broke the law in terms of using his governor's plane for political purposes. And, it's the same old thing, Sam. This is the age that we're living in now. I think that over the last 30 or 40 years, there's been a pretty steady and consistent corruption and corrosion of values in these various institutions. And I think that we're living kind of at the end point of all of this, and we're going to see change. But that's the end of our show, Sam. I want to thank you for joining us. Thank our guest, Kurtis Hanna.
That's the State of the Union Tuesday.
In the State of the Union. Thank you to everyone who's tuning in. Again, we broadcast live every Saturday from 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock on SCC Television Studios. And we also play on SPNN in St. Paul. May God bless you. May God bless America. And vaya con Dios.